Okay, let's jump straight into this deep dive. You've shared a really fascinating piece of source material with us. It's a paper taking a deep look at the Baha'i Faith, exploring its core claims, its perspective on other world religions, and, well, its vision for the future.
That's right.
Our goal today is pretty straightforward. We want to be your guides through this specific paper. We're here to unpack its key arguments, pull out the interesting insights, and just to help you get a handle on what this source material is actually saying. Sort of a shortcut to understanding this document. And I have to say, I'm already pretty curious about some of the foundational ideas it puts forward.
Absolutely. And it's important, to frame this correctly. The source material you've given us is very much a theological argument. It presents a really detailed case aiming to establish the Baha'i Faith's unique position and its relevance for the modern world. It does this using its own internal logic, interpretations from its scriptures, its history.
Got it. So internal logic, specific interpretations, that's our focus.
Exactly.
So as we dive in, we'll look at the core claim the paper makes, then its view on why earlier religions are, well, seen as insufficient now. We'll also cover the obstacles it says prevent people from recognizing Baha'u'lláh, how it argues prophecies are fulfilled, and the solutions it offers for today's crises. And, crucially, we're sticking only to what's presented in this paper we're looking at.
Right.
Let's start then with the bedrock idea this source presents. Progressive revelation. What does the paper actually mean by that?
This is really the fundamental principle the whole paper rests on. It suggests that God's truth isn't just dropped on humanity all at once. Instead, it unfolds gradually, progressively, through a series of messengers or manifestations, as the paper calls them, throughout history.
Okay, like chapters in a book. Or maybe steps in education.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Like a curriculum that gets more advanced as the student humanity, in this case, matures. The paper argues each messenger was perfectly suited to humanity's capacity at the time and, the specific needs of their era and location.
And the paper actually names some of these figures, doesn't it, to illustrate this lineage?
It does. It places many major religious founders within this single ongoing divine plan. It mentions Moses bringing laws suited for a tribal society just starting out, Christ, whose message of love was universal, but maybe, the paper implies, beyond the full grasp of people back then, Muhammad, establishing a socio-legal framework needed in 7th century Arabia. And interestingly, it explicitly includes figures associated with Hinduism and Buddhism in the same divine educator role.
So if each messenger had a specific context, what does the paper argue Baha'u'llah's revelation is specifically for? What's different now?
Well, according to this source, Baha'u'llah's message is tailored for what it sees as a mature, globally interconnected humanity. It addresses needs that previous faiths, designed for earlier stages, couldn't fully cover. Things like achieving global unity, reconciling science and religion, establishing collective security. These are framed as the paramount issues of our time.
Okay, and this is where the paper makes a really significant move, right? It doesn't just place the Baha'i faith next in line.
Exactly. This is crucial to the paper's argument. It's not just another religion in the sequence. The paper argues it's the culmination, the fulfillment of all these previous dispensations, and its ultimate purpose, as stated in the source, is the establishment of a unified global civilization, what it calls the kingdom of God on earth.
Wow, okay. That's a very strong central claim. So if it's the fulfillment, then the paper naturally has to explain why the religions that came before are now seen as, well, insufficient. Even though they're part of the same divine plan, what reasons does it offer?
It gives a few key arguments for this perceived insufficiency today. One is what it terms contextual limitations. The idea is because each previous faith was designed for a specific time, a specific people, their laws and social teachings, while perfect then, aren't necessarily sufficient or universally applicable for the entire planet now.
Makes sense, given the globalization point earlier. So.
Another big one the paper points to is doctrinal rigidity. It argues that over time, human institutions, specifically clergy within these older faiths, tended to solidify interpretations. They fixed meanings, created rigid dogmas, sometimes moving away from the original, more dynamic spirit of the teachings.
And it gives an example of this, doesn't it? Something about wine.
Yes, it brings up Christian sacramental wine. The paper views this as an example of that rigidity, maybe even a deviation, especially when contrasted with what it interprets as Christ's own warnings against intoxication or drunkenness.
Interesting. Okay, so context rigidity. What's the third reason? It felt like it was about followers maybe missing the point.
Precisely. The third point the paper raises is failed eschatology.
Eschatology, that's the study of end times, right?
Exactly. Theology concerned with the ultimate destiny, end of days, prophecies about the future. The source claims that many followers of prior religions got stuck expecting a literal, very physical return of their prophets or messiahs, and because they were looking for that physical spectacle, the paper argues, they completely missed the symbolic, the spiritual fulfillment that it claims happened with the coming of Baha'u'lláh.
Okay, so limitations of the past, interpretations becoming rigid, and followers misreading the signs, according to this paper. If the Baha'i faith is positioned as this global fulfillment, then the paper also needs to explain why it hasn't just been universally accepted. What obstacles does it say are in the way?
Good question. The source identifies two main hurdles, really, that it argues prevent wider recognition of Baha'u'llah's claims.
Okay, what's the first?
The first one is framed as attachment to outdated traditions. The paper uses that powerful metaphor from Jesus in the Gospels, Matthew 9:17.
Ah, the new wine into old wineskins idea.
Exactly. You can't pour new wine into old wineskins without them bursting. The idea is that people tend to cling to the familiar forms, the rituals, the interpretations of past religions, even when a new, updated revelation comes along. The old structures just can't hold the new essence.
And does it give concrete examples of these old wineskins?
Yes, it does. It talks about people prioritizing outward rituals like literal water baptism over the inner spiritual meaning, like rebirth. It mentions exclusive salvation claims. The paper specifically cites the Latin phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, outside the church there is no salvation, as an example of this kind of thinking. And it also points to clinging to cultural dogmas like caste systems or strict gender segregation, justifying them through older religious laws that the paper argues are now superseded.
That makes sense within the paper's logic. What's the second major obstacle it identifies? This one seemed quite critical of religious leadership.
It absolutely is. The second major barrier, according to the source's analysis, is the role of clergy in distorting religious truth. The paper argues quite strongly that clerical institutions across different faiths have historically acted as, well, gatekeepers. It claims they've often misinterpreted sacred texts or frozen interpretations in time, or even actively suppressed teachings or new understandings to maintain their own power and specific interpretations.
Strong words. Does it offer examples to back that up?
It does. For Christianity, it points to historical instances where it argues the church resisted new scientific discoveries or suppressed dissent. Galileo is mentioned as a kind of classic example. For Islam, it discusses the influence of the ulama, the religious scholars, in enforcing what's called taqlid, basically, blind adherence to past legal interpretations, which the paper argues stifles independent reasoning. And for Judaism, it suggests that rabbinic legalism, at times, could obscure the deeper spiritual meaning of scriptures, including prophecies the paper claims pointed towards Baha'u'lláh.
A direct critique of established religious authority across the board. And this section also included that specific case study about wine, connecting it back to this idea of clerical influence.
Yes, exactly. The paper uses this as a kind of specific illustration of its broader point, how it believes original ethics can get twisted or ritualized over time, diverging from the founder's intent, often due to later interpretations. It focuses on the misinterpretation of wine in Christianity.
Right. So it points out Jesus warned against drunkenness.
Yes, it references passages like Luke 21:34, but then it argues later Christian practice embedded the use of actual wine in communion. From the paper's perspective, this ritualization seems to overlook or even contradict that original ethical stance against intoxication.
Okay, and how does the paper then link this to Baha'i teaching specifically?
It makes a direct connection. The source highlights that Baha'u'lláh, in his main book of laws, the Kitab-i-Aqdas, includes an explicit prohibition on consuming alcohol. The paper presents this not just as a new rule, but as a deliberate restoration, a correction, if you will. It's framed as bringing back the original pure ethical standard regarding intoxicants that, in the paper's view, had been compromised or lost in previous traditions, partly through clerical interpretation and ritualization. It's a very pointed example.
It definitely is. Okay, so we've got the core claim, the reasons prior faiths are seen as insufficient now, and the obstacles tradition and clergy. Let's move to another huge part of the paper's argument, the claim that Baha'u'lláh actually fulfills prophecies from these earlier religions. What examples does the source pull out?
Right, this is a major section. The source spends considerable effort reinterpreting various prophecies from different traditions, arguing they all point towards Baha'u'lláh.
Starting with Christian prophecies, what does it say there?
Yes. For Christianity, it tackles, for instance, the famous promise of the Son of Man coming in the clouds from Matthew 24. The paper argues this isn't about a physical return, someone literally descending from the sky. It interprets it spiritually. Baha'u'llah's coming is that return. And the clouds. The paper suggests they symbolize the things that obscure divine truth, like human disagreements, theological doctrines, earthly attachments, the very things through which the new messenger has to break.
Okay, a symbolic reading. What about the New Jerusalem? That's a powerful image from Revelation.
It addresses that too, the New Jerusalem descending from heaven in Revelation 21. Again, the paper interprets this spiritually and symbolically. It suggests this prophecy finds its symbolic fulfillment in the establishment of the Baha'i World Center, the complex of administrative and spiritual buildings on Mount Carmel in Haifa, Israel. This is presented as the spiritual and administrative heart of the promised New World Order.
Interesting. Okay, shifting to Islam. What Islamic prophecies does the paper claim are fulfilled?
Well, for Islam, the source looks at the concept of Yom al-Qiyamah, the day of resurrection, or the day of judgment. It interprets this not as a literal end-of-the-world event, but as the dawn of a new spiritual era initiated by a new manifestation of God, which, of course, it identifies with Baha'u'llah's revelation. It's a spiritual resurrection, a new awakening for humanity.
And it also mentions figures like the Mahdi.
Yes, it addresses the Shia expectation of the Mahdi, the guided one, and also the return of Jesus, which is important in Islamic eschatology too. The paper argues that the Báb, who was the immediate forerunner and herald of Baha'u'lláh, fulfilled the specific expectations associated with the Mahdi, according to the paper's interpretation of relevant Islamic traditions.
And it doesn't stop with Christianity and Islam, does it? It casts the net wider.
Correct. It connects to Jewish scripture as well. The paper links the descriptions of the Messianic age in the book of Isaiah, the famous imagery like the wolf dwelling with the lamb from Isaiah 11. It connects this vision directly to the Baha'i aim of achieving universal peace and global unity. It presents Baha'u'llah's mission as the catalyst for fulfilling this ancient prophetic vision of harmony replacing conflict.
Any other traditions mentioned?
It briefly touches on others. For instance, it notes perceived parallels between Baha'u'llah's role as a world reformer and the prophecy of the Kalki avatar in some Hindu traditions, who is expected to appear at the end of the current age to restore righteousness.
So across the board, the paper is essentially reinterpreting well-known prophecies from major faiths, arguing they were symbolic pointers towards Baha'u'lláh rather than literal future events.
That's a very accurate summary of the paper's approach to prophecy, yes. Spiritual and symbolic fulfillment.
Okay, so given this foundation fulfillment of prophecy, the culmination of revelation, the paper then logically presents the Baha'i faith itself as the remedy for the crises facing the world today. What unique solutions does it highlight?
It puts forward several core Baha'i principles as the necessary medicine, if you like, for humanity's current ailments. First and foremost is the principle we started with, the unity of religions. Just recognizing that all these prophets, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Baha'u'lláh, and others, are fundamentally educators from the same divine source, teaching humanity stage by stage. That recognition itself is presented as a solution to religious conflict.
Okay, unity is a core solution. What else?
Another foundational principle it emphasizes is the essential harmony of science and religion. The paper is very clear on this. True religion, it argues, must align with reason and scientific discovery. It explicitly rejects blind faith or any form of fundamentalism that contradicts established scientific understanding. Truth is one, basically.
That's a significant principle in today's world. Any more concrete proposals?
Yes. Perhaps one of the most specific and forward-looking proposals mentioned is the call for global governance. The paper notes that Baha'u'llah's Kitab-i-Aqdas actually includes a specific call for the world's rulers and governments to establish some form of world parliament or international body, the purpose being collective security, resolving disputes peacefully, and managing global resources for the benefit of all humanity. That's a very concrete structural solution proposed in the texts.
It is. Does the paper also mention how these principles are supposedly working out in practice? Any empirical success, as it were?
It does touch on that, though perhaps with less detail than the theological arguments. It mentions interfaith engagement as something Baha'i communities actively pursue. It notes they often initiate or participate in dialogues between different faiths, emphasizing that this is done without proselytizing, without trying to convert others. It also points to grassroots development efforts undertaken by Baha'is around the world, things focused on education, promoting gender equality, social and economic development projects. It gives the Tahiri Justice Center as one example of an organization inspired by these principles, working on social justice issues.
Now, what about the individual Baha'i? Does the paper say anything about their personal responsibility in all this?
It does touch on that. It describes a moral responsibility that stems from that core belief. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. This implies, a duty for individuals to work towards the betterment of the whole world and also to share these teachings, but respectfully. And crucially, it stresses the principle of independent investigation of truth. The paper emphasizes that every person has the capacity and the right to investigate reality for themselves, actively discouraging blind faith or just following dogma. Open-minded personal inquiry is key.
Okay, so we've really walked through the paper's entire argument now. The core claim of progressive revelation, the critique of past faiths and clergy, the alleged prophecy fulfillments, and these proposed solutions. How does the source wrap all this up? What's its concluding message?
Well, the paper finishes with a very strong, very assertive conclusion about the Baha'i Faith's place in the grand scheme of things. It flatly states that it's not just another sect or religion among many. It presents it as the fulfillment of humanity's entire spiritual journey. It explicitly calls it a divine system, designed for nothing less than global transformation.
And it circles back to why people might not see it that way.
Yes, it reiterates its points about the obstacles. It argues that failure to recognize this claim comes down to being trapped either by traditionalism, that clinging to old forms and rituals, or by clerical manipulation, being misled by religious leaders who, the paper argues, distort truth to maintain their own authority.
And the paper's final claim is pretty definitive.
Extremely definitive. It leaves the reader with the unambiguous assertion that embracing Baha'u'llah's teachings is, from the paper's perspective, the only coherent path forward, the only sufficient solution to the complex web of spiritual, social, and global crises that humanity is facing. It positions the Baha'i Faith not just as a belief system, but as a comprehensive divine blueprint for the future of civilization itself.
Wow. Okay. We've definitely covered a lot of ground there, really digging into the specific arguments and the overall narrative presented in this paper you shared with us. It lays out a very comprehensive worldview, taking a clear and quite bold stance on its own significance in religious history and for the world today.
Absolutely. It's a detailed and self-contained argument.
So hopefully this deep dive into the source material has given you, the listener, a solid overview. We aim to pull out those key insights, the core idea of progressive revelation culminating in Baha'u'llah.
Right, and the paper's critique of why earlier religions, and particularly their clerical structures, are seen as inadequate for today's global needs.
These specific claims about fulfilling prophecies from Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other traditions.
And finally, the solutions the Baha'i Faith proposes, according to this paper, are things like the unity of religions, harmony of science and religion, and that call for global governance.
Exactly. We hope walking through the paper like this has been helpful.
And just to leave you with something to think about, drawing directly from the source's powerful conclusion. This paper doesn't just suggest an answer. It argues the Baha'i Faith offers the only coherent solution, presenting itself as a divine blueprint for civilization.
So the question it leaves hanging, really, is, what does it mean? For us as individuals, for society as a whole, when a single religious framework makes such an all-encompassing claim? To hold the exclusive key, essentially, to resolving humanity's deepest spiritual and global problems.
It definitely raises some big questions, doesn't it? Questions about truth, authority, the nature of progress, and how we might organize ourselves as a global community in the future. Lots to ponder there.